Not yet. Oh, I see that we're live.
We are live, Annalisa. So, good morning. Nobody is watching us just yet, but I'm sure we'll get some people come on along and say hello to us because it's good morning here in Australia, in Sydney at 8 o'clock in the morning, and afternoon for you, Annalisa, there in the US.
Yes, I'm outside of Denver, Colorado.
Yeah. I loved Colorado. I'm Vanessa Talbot, profile builder for coaches and change makers who want to have big impact in the world. And with me is Annalisa Parrott, who is a writing coach. And also, why we are having this chat today is she's also a podcast host of the Writing Gym, which I have been fortunate enough to be a guest on as well. So thank you for that. Tell us a little bit more about what you actually do, Annalise, before we hop into having a bit of a conversation about podcast etiquette and why it matters.
Sure. So as a podcaster, I speak every week with top-level agents, New York Times bestsellers, publishers, editors about current trends in the publishing industry. And as a writing coach, I help fiction writers and entrepreneurs to get their message out into the world.
Yeah, so we kind of do a similar thing, except you're with the writers getting their message out, and I'm with the coaches getting their message out as well, helping them to get that out. So we'll be able to see if anyone is wanting to ask any questions at all of Annalisa or myself, of course, just pop it into the comments because we can see your live comments. Like that, for example. Can you see that, Annalisa? No? You must just see. How cool is that? That's yeah, it's cool how you can see. So if anyone has a comment, we can actually, or wants to ask a question, we can actually pop it up there and we'll be able to read it and see it and answer you as well. So let's hop straight into it. Podcast etiquette. Why is that important anyway to actually, know how to have manners around being, I'm going to go with being a podcast guest first off, but I still reckon there's got to be some etiquette to be held as a podcast host as well. But podcast guests, what do you think are some of the main things that they need to remember or know or do?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, Vanessa. And the thing is about any etiquette that we're talking about is that we need to remember that all of these networking opportunities that we're doing, everything that we're doing for visibility, I know that's an old word now, we're throwing that one out, but anything that we're doing is about relationship. And when we think about etiquette, these are ways that we can maintain positive relationships with people. And so if we're thinking about an underlying philosophy on how we're going to approach any kind of networking opportunity, whether it's in person or a podcast or, sending a press release to a journalist, these interactions are all about maintaining positive relationships. And so I think if we keep that philosophy in mind, then that can help to dictate some of our actions as we move forward into that relationship.
So as a podcast host, you would no doubt get people pitching to you or asking to be a guest on your show. What's some of the major mistakes you see when people are pitching to your podcast? Which I'm assuming if they're making mistakes there, they're probably making some little mistakes everywhere else as well with pitching.
Sure. There's a fine line between being assertive and being over the top, right? And so, in the same way that if you're at a cocktail party, you don't want to be standing by the punch bowl with the guy who only wants to talk about himself or the girl who only wants to talk about herself. There again, we're going back to the relationship there. Someone who presents themselves in an arrogant way or comes across as thinking that they're better than anyone else, or that kind of attitude is a real turnoff, right? Because we want to talk to people who are enjoyable, who have information to share, who are open and willing to share their area of expertise with other people. So, you know, when we get someone who, you know, uses a lot of I statements or is also demanding what it is that we're going to supply to them, that's a red flag for our team to say, this probably isn't a really good fit for us.
Mm. Yeah. And, you know, just as an example here, as a Facebook group creator as well, you know, at least once a week, we do get, and particularly me or my admin team, will get people wanting to approach us, and what they're wanting obviously is certain privileges in the group or certain access to the audience in the group, which we don't give, by the way. But yeah, when you get that, like you said, there's that fine line between being, you know, asking and then being a little ballsy, I suppose, in the way that you're in there asking for it. And, you know, I've had comments like, your people need me and stuff like that. And that's, for me, is an instant, you're not going to even get a look in. So, yeah, I can actually see how that would happen. And, yeah, most certainly with podcasts as well. What else comes to mind when you're thinking about some of the things for podcast etiquette? I always think, you know, because I don't have my own podcast, I do little interviews like this, and I love high-profile Q&A, and I love it when, you know, just the little things, you know, when I don't have to worry about the guest because they've shown up, you know, 5 minutes beforehand or whatever, so I know that they're there ready and waiting to go, rather than me noting my fingers on broadcast time, worrying that they're going to show up. Have you got any other little things that you think are good podcast etiquette?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really important one. And not only that, but testing the technology. So, you know, meeting with you today, this is a new technology to me. So I logged in a couple of minutes early to make sure it was going to work on my computer. We've had to postpone the recording of a podcast for people who, you know, were holding a smartphone, a tablet, a computer, and weren't able to access the software. You know, that could have easily been avoided had they logged in, you know, 20 minutes, 15 minutes early, and we could have troubleshot those technology issues, because technology issues are going to happen. It's part of life. But anything that we can do to mitigate some of that and start in a timely manner is good for the entire team. So certainly showing up on time, preparing that technology in advance. But one of the things that we find to happen frequently, Vanessa, is that we get stood up. Yeah, so that that's almost like a slap in the face, because I think some people maybe don't realize the amount of work that goes into the preparation for a podcast, because our team is looking at the applications, we're accepting these people, and we've only got so many time slots, so we're giving that time to someone else. You know, we could have had another guest on, but we've slated this person, and frequently it happens. My assistant emails them 2 days before their appearance, and it happens frequently that fewer than 24 hours we hear that they've got something else they need to do, and that makes it really difficult for us. We can't schedule a new guest at that point. We've done all of the preparation at that point, so that's hours of preparation that I and my assistant have put into a particular episode to create the framework for that episode. That doesn't happen. And you're not going to believe this, Vanessa, but it's even happened to us that we've seen people then post on their Facebooks, you know, that they appeared on another podcast or that they appeared on another radio show shortly after ours would have gone to air. And, you know, that is just, that's poor etiquette to do that kind of thing, to stand someone up and then to go out with someone else. I think we can all understand that. We all went to high school. We know what that kind of behavior is like. And it's the same thing with a podcast. It's fine for you to change your mind. And if you get stage fright, I think that it's really okay to be honest with your podcast host about that in advance. But last minute standing up isn't okay for a date, and it's not okay for a podcast either.
I absolutely agree. I couldn't think of anything more annoying than being all prepared, ready to go, and then your guest just doesn't show up. And I dare say you'd never ask them again.
Right. I mean, and it closes that. So, my team and I, we send out a lot of referrals for people who have been on our podcast because they're experts in various areas, and my team and I, we were having a conversation. We needed an expert in a particular field to help one of our clients. And we thought, that person. And someone said, they stood us up for the podcast, and they were out immediately. Right? So those were referrals because that made them look very unreliable. I'm not going to recommend someone who stood me up because they're not reliable.
Yeah, exactly right. And I was thinking the same thing, your reputation, our industry, as much as it looks massive, there's a lot of people and we know one another, we refer one another, and tell me it doesn't take much before you kind of put on the outer as such. So keep your behavior good, be gracious, be nice. I mean, I've heard people, we don't talk openly about it, but I've heard little, people talking amongst themselves about someone's bad behavior in some sense and how they wouldn't recommend them and stuff like that, or they won't work with them or won't collaborate with them. So all that stuff matters if you want to build your connection with other influencers in your field. This stuff matters.
Absolutely.
So if you just stand someone up, they're gonna feel that and probably not be overly happy to refer you or recommend you again at all. So very, very interesting.
Absolutely.
Another thing that you talked about was the technology thing, and I just have a little story around that one. I always remember when I first started doing this, which was 5 years ago when my book came out, and I had to do, for the first time ever, I had to do radio shows and stuff like that over in the US, and I had no idea how to call international, even how to call into these radio shows, or even how to do the internet Skype thing. And one thing I would make sure that I did every time was, with at least 24 hours beforehand, I'd give it a bit of a test run so that I wasn't, stuck there at the last minute trying to figure out what to do. Because it happened to another coach that I know, and he had his first US show podcast. And the particular way that you had to ring in, I think, might have been a little bit different or something. Anyway, when it came down to the time he was to call in, he couldn't do it. He had no idea. So, so he couldn't call in on, and I think it was a live online radio show or something, which is even worse. It's not pre-recorded, it was live. And so the guest didn't show up. So after about 10, 15 minutes of trying to get on, he gave up on it and then contacted the radio show host to say, can we reschedule? And guess what the radio show host said?
No way.
No way. Yeah, you stood me up. Even there, but I was trying to get on, my technology wouldn't work, it was too bad, because it was live. I guess he looked like a bit of a fool because the guest didn't show up and he had to run his show then somehow else. So that's something to be mindful of, because sometimes you'll get a second chance, sometimes you won't.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, we have a very strict policy at this point. And it doesn't matter if you're one of our VIP guests or if you're just sort of one of our normal guests. If you stand us up, there's no invitation to come back. Conversely, guests that we've had who offer a lot of great content, who are great to talk to, really helpful, we've had them back already for a second and third time because they do offer that content because they show up, they're present, they're answering questions that people ask, and we love having those people. And so they're getting a lot of exposure. We're one of the fastest growing writing podcasts on iTunes. That's pretty exciting. So
that is exciting.
Yeah, they're getting a lot of exposure from appearing on the podcast. It's very good for them, and of course it's great for us to have them around to talk to us.
In terms of guests, I was wondering, what's the etiquette in terms of, once you've been on a show, I always like to then share the show with my group and with my audience. Not always with my list, but sometimes I put it in with my list as well. But I certainly love to put it on my pages on social media and Facebook groups and that. What do you think the etiquette is around when you've been on a show? Because for me personally, I believe if you've been asked to be on a show, the really respectful thing to do in return is to share that episode with your audience. Now, I've actually heard of some people, getting on shows, but then they don't actually share it with their audience in return. What do you think as a podcast host, etiquette-wise, around that particular area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I think that the assumption is that if someone is going to appear on our podcast, and this is one of the questions that we ask in the application very specifically, is that they're then going to be sharing that out on their social media at least as much as we are, right? So we're giving them a lot of free exposure. We're expecting that they do the same. And we're not really picky about, what they use for LinkedIn or they send it to their list. But we want them to be sharing that podcast information. And I think that that's just a kindness that we do for each other. I gave you something, you give me something. That's really great. And then the other thing, Vanessa, that a lot of people overlook when they appear on a podcast, and they may not realize how much work goes into it, but I've got a full team of people working on my podcast alone, creating memes and creating handouts to go with these podcast episodes. We have a very high quality podcast that we offer, as you know, because you appeared on the podcast. And it's really wonderful when we get a thank you. And it doesn't have to be a big, glorious, 3 dozen roses kind of a thank you. It can be a very simple, thanks for having me on the podcast. And one way of saying thank you is to then share that information with your audience and to show your appreciation for the effort that the podcast host put on your behalf.
Yeah, it's good that you raised that, because I was actually thinking one of the things that I do tell people in the Wow the Media training that will be starting tomorrow, actually, so that today is actually the last day to jump in if anyone wants to. But one of the oft forgotten things, if you get some media coverage or you apply to Source Bottle or something like that, it's the same thing. If they do actually feature you, you can write a little thank you note, and it just has to be a little email message or something, or if you're connected on social media, just flip a little thing, but it's just a thank you for that. So that was something that I actually learned from a journalist who told me that a lot of people, they just get the coverage and then they don't, then that's it. But a thank you is also a way of, I feel, extending that relationship as well, cementing the relationship that you've started to form. Mm-hmm. That's my thoughts on it. Mm.
Yeah, and you're spot on with that, right? Because it all comes back to where we started with, it's a relationship. And so I think some people, maybe they're shy, maybe they're insecure, but sometimes their behavior comes across as it's all about me. And that's the last thing that you want to have happen. So just really thinking, about how would the other person feel. It's never going to come across poorly if you send a thank you note. Some people might sort of, toss them into the recycle bin, but, it's a nice gesture to do. And, we had Bob Berg on the podcast, I don't know, maybe a month ago or so. And he was saying, and in his context, he was thinking about mentors, but I think that the advice is good. He said, always write a handwritten note. It doesn't have to be a fancy card. It doesn't have to be a fancy piece of paper, fold it in half, put it in a regular envelope. But that handwritten note can mean so much to a person, to just thank them for their time. And I think that that's really wise advice. I've kind of put that one in my hat as something I take along with me.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of sending a handwritten note myself. Probably, and it's probably because by the time I put it in the post office to you, it's going to take ages to get over there. But here in Australia, obviously, a few days and they'll have it. But internationally, it's going to take, a week or more. And so I hadn't thought of that one. So it's a good one that you've brought up, that something to think about, that one. I usually just, thank them in my posts, and sometimes send them a little message as well via email or Skype. But I do like the handwritten note idea, so that's a new one. Thank you for bringing that one up.
You're welcome. I credit that to Bob Berg, but it is a great one. And, the other thing that some people have done that's been really amazing, and you mentioned radio, way back in the day, I was a commentator on the radio, and when people sent books, that was really helpful. And I've had some guests on the podcast who send a copy of their book either before or after. And certainly when I receive that book beforehand, that gives me a lot more context to work with on that person. Now, we're a writing podcast, so it makes a lot of sense to send a book to someone who we're going to talk about writing. That might not always be an appropriate gesture. But certainly giving that information to your podcast host. Back in the day, right, we used to send promo packets with all of our little cards and things. We don't do that anymore. But any kind of information that you can give your podcast host, especially that's relevant to whatever niche it is that they're addressing, helps them to be able to ask you better questions. So when I have their book in hand and I can hold it up on the podcast and say, I read this book and I love that. Well, that's great for me as I'm asking questions, but that sure is great publicity for them as well.
Yeah, no, good idea. And I guess if you are on that author trail and you are doing that, then I always say it's really important to send those books out wherever you can. I remember when I was doing that, we would, and I don't know if it's still the same thing, but a lot of people just also ask not for the hard copy of the book, but just the digital download version of it as well. So I don't know if that's still what goes on now, but if the digital download version, the ebook, so to speak, is still okay to send, or if you actually prefer to get a hard, the printed version.
I think that the hard copy is kind of a gift to people, and the ebook is more of a, here's some information about who I am. I think you can't go wrong if you're sending a gift no matter what, but, as a gesture, I think that the hard copy is a nice gift. And I might be a little biased because I like to hold books in my hand. So take that with a grain of salt as a book lover.
No, I actually think you're right. I do believe that it's like a gift. I mean, I have a little library out there too of my gifts that have been sent to me of, people who have written books and they've sent them to me, and it's fabulous to have them there. I've got quite a few out there. It's quite my little thing out there. So have you got any other, mishaps or stories to tell that might be interesting for people who want to know how to behave best when they are a podcast guest?
Sure. So the one thing that we haven't talked about yet, Vanessa, is how to act when you're actually on the podcast. And, I was speaking this weekend with a fellow business person who also has a podcast, and he was telling me this story about somebody he had on the podcast who did this type of behavior. So the host would ask a question and he would say, well, Bob, in my book in chapter 17, I outlined the steps to, and it was just obnoxious after a certain point that every response to a question was, in my book, horse breeding or whatever the person wrote, I said, and it became all about the person. And the other thing that some people will do is, well, if you look on my website, www.xyz.com, right? So if that just sounded ridiculous that I said that, it sounds really ridiculous on a podcast for you to just, kind of vomit your website out there. If you're worried about not getting enough exposure, that would be a question to ask ask at the beginning of a podcast. We introduce, before we even start taping, we talk to our guest, ask if they have any questions. We give them a rundown of what the episode's going to look like so they feel comfortable with the structure. If you're uncertain how you're going to get exposure from this podcast, you're certainly welcome to ask that before you even begin taping or that it goes live, so that you don't feel like you have to say the title of your book 86 times or vomit your website out there 86 times. That you can just have a conversation with people. Again, back to that relationship. Because I think if you're standing around the water cooler, it would feel really awkward to be like, well, Vanessa, in my book, How to Breed Horses, on page 17, talk like that. I hope. I mean, most people don't converse like that. I might say, hey, Vanessa, I wrote a book about horses. And you might say, really, tell me more. But we don't go into the details and converse. And I certainly am not going to stand by the water cooler and say, hey, Vanessa, here's my book. Want to buy it? Want to buy it? Want to buy it? Want to buy it? Because you will walk away. That doesn't work in relationships. So, just be thinking about those kinds of behaviors. If it seems like a bad idea at the water cooler, it's definitely a bad idea during a podcast. And the last thing that I will say about that is around expletives. So, some people like to swear a lot, some people do not. People have different philosophies on that. And so if you are someone who likes to swear, that's definitely a question to ask beforehand. Some of our best podcast guests, people we've had on, ask those types of questions before we go live. I frequently swear, is that okay with your audience? I frequently talk about, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Is that okay with your audience? Just to do that check-in to see, what are the guidelines here? What are the rules? Especially if this podcast is on iTunes, because iTunes has different grades, kind of like how movies have different ratings. Mm-hmm. And, if the podcaster breaks those rules, they can get kicked off of iTunes. So you want to be sure to check. And I will tell you that this business person that I met with, who had the egregiously self-promoting person on his podcast, he never aired that episode. He just wrote to the person and said, dude, sorry, this isn't going to go. Because all he did was talk about himself, and there was no value for the podcaster's audience at that point.
That's absolutely right. Like, we've got a bit of feedback there. Let's hope it goes. I was just thinking about that as well, just thinking like when you get on a podcast or an interview, it's about giving value. But I think when people come on and all they want to talk about is, on page 22 and in my book, then obviously they're thinking it's just about promoting them, when it's actually not. It's about giving value to the audience, and just promoting yourself is actually not giving value. That's the way I see it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's just, I really feel it's just that misconception in them of what they're actually on the podcast for.
Exactly. And you can get some exposure from that experience. People are getting to know, like, and trust you just through the fact that you're there. You don't have to say, hey, everybody, look at how amazing I am. Everybody listen to me, buy my book. Nobody wants to listen to that. So, just keep that in mind. Take a deep breath and say, I'm going to work to deliver value to this audience in the best way that I know how. And I'm going to have a good experience with this person, and we're going to have a really meaningful conversation. And if something comes out of that, that's great.
Yeah, I'm with you, because I think, every time I've had a guest on, and I don't do a lot, so I said the interviews, but every time I've had them on, they've just given maximum value. And from that, they've then had people want to follow them or take up their offers or whatever. It really seems to work. I'm lucky that I haven't ever had anyone on that's just, like you said, vomited out all their promo stuff. They've actually come on and known that they're there to really, educate or enter the audience that are there with them and listening. So I've been very lucky. I can see your dogs just walked in the back there. It's my place. Nobody can see mine because they're all at the front here. They're on the other side of the camera, but there's rabbits and a bird.
I love it.
kangaroo is outside as well. I threw her outside because she's getting bigger and naughtier.
Oh.
Have you got... Yeah, well, the kangaroo's gone out to get her oats, bone oats, same things. Any other things that you think are really, really important if you are going to be a podcast guest?
No, I think that we've covered it, you know, in
I think
sort
we've
of a
done
very
good.
before, during, and after. You know, maintaining that relationship, really treating that person respectfully and honoring their time and their expertise. And, you know, that you're a guest in their home, so to speak, their digital home. And, you know, if you wouldn't put your feet on the couch when you're visiting grandma, then please don't misbehave on someone else's podcast.
And I think for some people, it's just about knowing the right behaviour, though. So this is going to be so handy. I'll definitely be sharing it as well and taking all these tips and giving them to when we work on the podcast module in Wow the Media. So we do have a podcast module that's going to show them how to actually approach to become a guest, but I'll also talk about how to behave on a podcast as well. So all these tips, Annalisa, are going to be amazing, and I'm going to be so happy to be able to share them with the participants in that particular training as well. So in the training, they actually get to see how to actually approach by email for the different podcasts as well. So that's going to be lots and lots and lots of learning and lots of fun. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to share my podcast experience with your audience.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking as a guest, just before I even go, you know, because I said I'm more guest than host, and I'm trying to think of every time I've been a guest, and I'm trying to think of some of the things where the host could have had some etiquette. But you know what? I've been so lucky. I've never had a crappy host yet. So I've been lucky to connect with all the good ones so far. So lucky me. Thank you so much, Annalisa. If anyone wants to catch Annalisa's podcast, of course, it is the Writing Gym, where you get access to listening to what we get. You get top authors. What else did you say? Agents, book marketers, editors, publishers, the whole work. So if you are on a journey with your own book and you want access to heaps and heaps of great quality information from all the people that know about getting a book out there, then it's the Writing Gym. And you can just find that on YouTube, on iTunes, can't you?
iTunes, yep, Writing Gym podcast.
Yes, and thank you so much. It's been so valuable for me to listen to, and I can hear some of the mistakes because, you know, I even see some of my clients do them, and when I find out they've done them, I'm like, ah! And I think, as I said, for a lot of time, it's for the newbies. They just don't know this stuff. So having this available for them to be able to listen to is going to be fantastic. Thank you so much, Annalisa. Have a beautiful day. Well, evening for you. I'm going to thanks so much. If anyone's interested in joining Wow the Media, it is the last day to be able to join because we are kicking off tomorrow. So check the link for that. Pop on into that program and you will learn how to wow the media so that you can get maximum exposure and reach more people. That's going to give you greater impact and possibly even greater income, of course, when you're reaching more people. So we'd love to have you in that as well. Bye-bye, and thanks so much.